Welcome back, everyone, to Bella Dark Tales. I'm so glad you're here tonight, settling in wherever you are, maybe with the lights low and the door locked. Before we get into tonight's story, I want to give a very special thank you to the person who sent this one in. Her name is Dana Kellerman, and she writes to us all the way from Portland, Oregon. Dana, thank you so much for trusting us with this. She says, and I want to read this exactly the way she wrote it. She says, Bella, I've been sitting on this for almost 3 years. I signed documents. I was told never to speak about what happened at that facility. But I can't keep carrying this alone anymore. Change my name if you need to. Change the location if you have to. Just make sure people know what goes on behind those walls. Make sure they know that some rules exist not to protect the research, but to protect the researchers from whatever is already inside. Dana, we hear you. And tonight, we're going to tell your story. So get comfortable. Turn off the lights if you're brave enough. And please do not go to sleep until this one is finished. Because this story doesn't end the way you think it does. I work at a government research lab, and there are rules. My name, for the purpose of this story, is not going to be my real name. If you're reading along or listening, just know that I've asked for certain things to be changed. My actual name, the actual location of the facility, and the names of my coworkers have all been altered. Because I signed a non-disclosure agreement that runs 37 pages long, and I have seen, firsthand, what this organization does to people who break it. So for tonight, you can call me Mara. And you can believe every single word I'm about to tell you. I got the job in late autumn, 3 years ago. I had just finished my second year of graduate school in biochemistry at a university in the Pacific Northwest. I had been struggling financially, the way most graduate students do, living off a stipend that barely covered rent and eating a lot of peanut butter and crackers. The kind of life that feels noble when you're in it but looks pretty bleak from the outside. So when the recruiter reached out to me through my university's career portal, I didn't think twice about setting up a phone interview. The posting was vague. Federally affiliated research institution, it said. Competitive salary, full benefits, housing provided on site. That last part should have been my first warning sign, honestly. Who offers housing on site for a research position? What kind of facility needs its employees that close, that contained? But I was 26 and I was broke and I had student loans stacking up behind me like a wall I couldn't see over. So I said yes. The phone interview was unusual. Most academic or government positions have you talk to a panel of people, department heads, HR representatives, maybe a senior researcher or two. This was just one man. He had a flat, measured voice, the kind of voice that sounds like it was trained to reveal nothing. He asked me about my research background, my familiarity with biosafety protocols, whether I had any history of anxiety disorders or claustrophobia, whether I was comfortable working in environments with restricted cell phone access, and whether I had any dependents, family members who would need regular contact, anyone who would notice or be alarmed if I was, as he put it, periodically unavailable for communication. I told him I was single, that my parents were in Ohio and we weren't particularly close, that I didn't have a dog or a cat or even a houseplant at that point, because I couldn't keep anything alive on what I was making. He seemed satisfied with that. He told me I would be contacted within 72 hours. They called back in 14. The hiring process took about 6 weeks after that. Background checks, clearance applications, a psychological evaluation that lasted an entire day and felt less like a mental health screening and more like someone trying to map every corner of my personality. There were ink blots and there were scenario questions, and there was one section near the end where a technician in a white coat sat across a table from me with a legal pad and asked me things like, If you witnessed something that disturbed you at work but were legally prohibited from discussing it, how would you manage that emotionally? And, do you believe there are things in this world that science has not yet explained? And my personal favorite, one I have thought about almost every day. Since, how do you respond to rules you don't fully understand the reason for? I answered all of them honestly. I said I was disciplined. I said I was rational. I said I trusted that institutions put protocols in place for good reasons, and that I didn't need to understand every reason to follow every rule. The man in the white coat wrote something on his legal pad and nodded slowly, and I remember thinking that I had given exactly the right answer. Now I'm not so sure. Now I wonder if the right answer would have been to get up, walk out that door, and never look back. I started the following January. A car picked me up from my apartment, a black SUV with tinted windows and government plates. I'd been told to pack for an extended stay, somewhere between 3 and 6 months initially, possibly longer. I was told the facility was in a rural area and that I would not be permitted to drive my own vehicle on site. My personal cell phone was collected at the gate, replaced with a facility-issued device that could make calls only to pre-approved numbers and had no internet access, no camera, no texting capability beyond basic internal messaging. I was given a small room in what they called the residential wing, which was essentially a dormitory attached to the main building by a long interior corridor. My room had a single bed, a desk, a window that looked out onto a concrete wall, and a small bookshelf that was already stocked with approved reading material, mostly scientific journals and a few novels that felt chosen for their blandness. On my first day, before I was shown a single piece of equipment or introduced to a single colleague, I was brought into a room with a long table and a woman who I came to know only as Administrator Chin. She was probably 50, with reading glasses perched at the end of her nose and the kind of posture that made you sit up straighter without her having to say a word. She placed a laminated card on the table in front of me. It was white, with a navy blue border, and printed on it in clean black font were what she called the facility rules. She told me to read them carefully. She told me that every employee received this card on their first day. She told me that the rules were not suggestions, they were not guidelines, they were not the kind of thing that had exceptions or gray areas. She told me that every person who had ever worked at this facility and experienced any kind of incident, any kind of problem, any kind of event that required outside intervention, had done so because they had failed to follow at least one of the rules on this card. Then she looked at me over the top of her glasses and said, very quietly, "We have found that people do better here when they understand from the beginning that the rules are not arbitrary. They exist because of specific events. Some of those events we can tell you about. Some of them we cannot. But the rules themselves are the distillation of those events, and you would do well to treat them as though your safety depends on following them to the letter." She paused. "Because in some cases it does." I picked up the card and I read it. I am going to recite the rules for you now, exactly as I remember them, because they are important to what happened later. Some of them seemed totally reasonable. Some of them seemed odd. And one of them, the one at the bottom, sent a chill up the back of my neck that I couldn't entirely explain at the time. Rule 1. All personnel must badge in and badge out of every secure zone without exception, including brief returns for forgotten items. Rule 2. No personnel are to remain in laboratory wings C after 2200 hours for any reason. This applies regardless of ongoing experiments, time-sensitive processes, or direct instruction from a supervisor. Rule 3. If you hear sounds from the ductwork that you cannot identify, exit the area immediately and report to the nearest security station. Do not attempt to investigate the source. Rule 4. All specimens in the Level 4 containment units are to be logged before and after every shift. If a log entry does not match between shifts, alert the shift supervisor before touching anything. Rule 5. Do not make eye contact with Specimen 7 through the containment glass. This is not optional. Rule 6. If the lights in any corridor flicker more than twice in succession, do not proceed further into that corridor. Return the way you came. Rule 7. Any personnel who experience unusual dreams featuring the facility layout, facility personnel, or any imagery from the research materials are required to report this to the medical team within 24 hours of the dream. Rule 8. If you find a door open that should be closed, do not close it yourself. Call it in and wait for security. Rule 9. Do not attempt to communicate with anyone in the observation suite outside of designated communication periods. Rule 10. If at any time you feel that you are being watched from inside a secure containment unit, leave the room. Do not look back. Do not discuss the feeling with colleagues. Report it only to the medical team. And then at the very bottom of the card, in slightly smaller print, almost like a footnote, the 11th rule. Rule 11. You will, at some point during your employment, hear your name spoken from a location where no person is present. Do not respond to it. Do not turn toward the sound. Continue what you are doing until you have exited the immediate area, then report the incident to Administrator Chen directly. I stared at that last rule for a long time. Administrator Chen watched me read it. When I looked up, she was already looking at me with an expression I can only describe as measured. Not unkind. Not dismissive. But very, very careful. I asked her, as neutrally as I could manage, whether Rule 11 was literal. Whether it was describing something that had actually happened to employees here. She said, "Every rule on that card describes something that has happened here. Every rule was written because of a specific incident, or a pattern of incidents. That one is no different." I asked her what happened to the people who turned toward the sound. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They are no longer with the facility." I could not tell, and I still cannot tell, whether she meant they had resigned, or been transferred, or whether she meant something else entirely. The way she said it, the flatness of it, made me not want to ask for clarification. I put the card in my lanyard pocket, and I went to meet my team. There were 8 of us in my immediate research group, working under a lead scientist named Dr. Harmon, a tall, angular man with the kind of deeply tired eyes that suggested he had been at the facility a very long time and had stopped expecting anything to surprise him. He shook my hand, gave me a tour of laboratory wings A and B, which were where we would be doing most of our work, and answered my questions with the practiced efficiency of someone who had given this exact tour many times before. He did not take me into Wing C. He did not explain Wing C. When I glanced down that corridor, he simply redirected me with a hand on my elbow and said, "That's not our area." My colleagues were friendly enough in the cautious, measured way of people who have learned not to get too close to anyone at a place like this. There was a woman named Priya who had been there almost 4 years and who seemed to have developed a talent for making the facility's peculiarities feel completely normal. There was a man named Joel who was funny and warm and who I noticed never, ever spoke about his work outside of designated discussion areas. There was a quiet researcher named Sam who I barely saw outside of scheduled team hours and who always seemed to be somewhere between exhausted and afraid, though I couldn't have told you why I got that impression from someone who barely spoke. The work itself, in those first few weeks, was genuinely interesting. Standard biochemical analysis, cataloging compounds, running assays, documenting results. Nothing I hadn't done in graduate school, just better equipped. The machines were newer, the lab space was cleaner, and the protocols were more rigorous, which I expected from a level 4 facility. I was busy and I was learning and I was well fed for the first time in years, and for a little while, I managed to almost forget about that laminated card in my lanyard pocket. Almost. The first thing that happened was small. So small I nearly convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. It was my third week. I was working late in Lab A, not past 2200, nowhere near Wing C, well within the rules. I was running an overnight culture analysis that required me to check on samples every 2 hours, and I had dozed off at my desk between checks. At some point, I woke up with the distinct and jarring feeling that someone was standing behind me. You know that feeling. You don't need to have experienced anything unusual in your life to know that feeling, the one where your body knows before your brain does, where the hairs on your arms stand up and your stomach does that slow, cold drop before you've even processed why. I turned around, because I'm a rational person and my rational mind said there was a reasonable explanation. A colleague stopping by, a security guard on rounds, Dr. Harmon coming to check on the overnight samples. But there was no one there. The lab was empty. The lights were steady, not flickering, so it wasn't Rule 6 territory. There was no sound from the ductwork, so it wasn't Rule 3. I sat there for a moment, heart beating a little faster than normal, and told myself it was the kind of disorientation you get from waking suddenly in an unfamiliar space. Made a note in my internal log. Went back to my samples. That was the first night. The second thing happened about 2 weeks after that, and it was harder to dismiss. I was in the specimen documentation room, which was a small anteroom between Lab B and the Level 4 containment wing. My job that afternoon was routine log verification, matching the end-of-shift logs against the beginning-of-shift logs from the previous rotation. It was tedious work, cross-referencing numbers, making sure nothing had changed in containment that wasn't accounted for. I had been doing it for about 40 minutes when I reached the log entries for the Level 4 units, and I found the discrepancy. It was subtle. One specimen listed as Unit 7B had a mass measurement of 12.4 kilograms in the closing log from the previous evening. In the opening log from this morning, the entry read 14.1 kilograms. A difference of 1.7 kilograms overnight in a sealed containment unit. I sat very still and looked at that number for a while. I knew enough biology to know that organisms don't just gain 1.7 kilograms overnight without a clear biochemical explanation. I also knew enough about the facility's protocols to know that this was exactly what Rule 4 was about. I was not to touch anything. I was to alert the shift supervisor. I found Priya in the corridor, explained what I'd found. She went very still in a way that I would come to recognize as the facility's version of someone fighting to stay calm. She thanked me, told me I had done exactly right, and told me to take my afternoon break and not mention the discrepancy to anyone other than Dr. Harmon. When I came back from break, the documentation room had been locked and there were 2 security personnel standing outside it with expressions that made it clear questions were unwelcome. I never found out what the explanation was for the weight discrepancy. The log was updated by the following day, both entries now reading 12.4 kilograms, as if the other number had never existed. When I mentioned it to Priya later, she gave me a small, tired smile and said, "The logs are sometimes updated in retrospect when data entry errors are identified." She said it in the tone of someone reciting a line they had memorized, in the way you might recite a prayer that you're no longer sure you believe in but can't afford to stop saying. I let it go. I kept doing my job. I kept my head down and my eyes off Specimen 7 and my badge in and out of every secure zone, and my feet pointed away from Wing C every evening after 10. I followed the rules. I was good at the rules. And then about 6 weeks in, I heard my name. I want to describe this carefully, because the thing about Rule 11, the thing I understand now that I didn't understand the first time I read it, is that it doesn't say you will hear a strange voice or a distorted sound or something obviously inhuman. It says you will hear your name. Just your name. The way a person says it when they are in the same room and they want your attention. Clear. Close. Familiar. I was walking down corridor 7, which connected the research wing to the residential dormitories. It was around 8 in the evening. I had finished my shift, and I was heading back to my room with a protein bar in one hand and a stack of approved reading material under my arm. The corridor was empty. The lights were steady. There was nothing unusual about the moment except that as I passed the alcove where the emergency supply cabinet was mounted on the wall, I heard, as clear as anything I have ever heard in my life, my name. My real name. Not Mara. My actual name, the one I was born with, the one only people who know me say. It came from the direction of the supply cabinet. It was a woman's voice. It was not a voice I recognized. It was not loud. It was the conversational, casual volume of someone standing about 3 feet away from you. Every rule on that card describes something that has happened here. I did not turn toward it. I am going to be honest with you. Staying in motion in that moment was one of the hardest physical acts of my life. Because the instinct to turn toward the sound of your name, especially when it is spoken that clearly and that close, is one of the most deeply wired human reflexes in existence. Something in us is designed to respond to our own name. It reaches into your nervous system and grabs hold. But I thought about the way Administrator Chen had said, they are no longer with the facility. And I kept walking. I did not look back. I did not speed up. I kept my pace even, because it seemed important not to run, not to show whatever might be in that alcove that I was afraid. I walked down the rest of corridor 7 and I went to my room and I sat on the edge of my bed for about 10 minutes doing nothing but breathing. Then I went and reported it to Administrator Chen. She was in her office even at that hour, which I found both reassuring and unsettling. She wrote down everything I said. She asked me a battery of questions. Was I tired? Had I been sleeping normally? Had I consumed anything unusual? Had I ever heard the voice before? What did it sound like? Did it say anything other than my name? Did I turn toward it? I told her I had not turned toward it. She looked at me over her glasses for a moment. Then she said, "Good. You did exactly right. This will be logged and reviewed. Please try to rest. If it happens again, come to me immediately." I asked her, again, what happened to people who turned toward it. This time she answered differently than she had the first time. This time, she took her glasses off and looked at me directly, and she said, "The ones who turned toward it and came back to report it described seeing something in the location where the sound came from. Something that appeared to be a person standing there. But when they looked more carefully, it was not quite right. The proportions were wrong. The face was wrong. And in every single case, within 72 hours of the event, those individuals began exhibiting psychological symptoms that required them to be transferred to the medical wing for assessment." She put her glasses back on. "None of them have returned to research duties." I went back to my room. I did not sleep well. Things were quiet after that for about 3 weeks. Quiet in the way of a hell breath. The way a house feels before a bad storm when the wind has gone oddly still. I did my work. I followed my rules. I ate in the cafeteria and made careful, limited small talk with Priya and Joel and tried not to think too hard about any of it. I called my mother on my facility phone once, a short, strained conversation that left me feeling lonelier than the silence had. It was during the 4th week after the voice incident that I had the dream. Rule 7. Any personnel who experience unusual dreams featuring the facility layout, facility personnel, or any imagery from the research materials are required to report this to the medical team within 24 hours. I know what you're thinking. Dreams. Of course there was a rule about dreams. These people had a rule about everything. But I want you to understand the dream, because it was not the kind of dream you dismiss when you wake up. It was not fragmented or symbolic the way most dreams are. It was completely linear. It had the quality of a memory rather than a fantasy. It was so coherent, so detailed, so relentlessly consistent in every element, that when I woke up at 3 in the morning gasping, I spent a full minute genuinely unsure whether I had been asleep or awake. In the dream, I was in Wing C. I had never been in Wing C in waking life. But in the dream, I knew it exactly, the way you know the layout of your childhood home. The corridor was longer than it looked from outside. The walls were pale green under fluorescent lighting. There were numbered doors on both sides, each with a small viewport window at eye level. The floor was slightly sticky, the way hospital floors sometimes are. There was a sound in the air that I can only describe as almost a sound, something at the edge of hearing that never quite resolved into anything identifiable. I was walking down this corridor toward a door at the far end. I was not walking because I wanted to. I was walking because something ahead of me was pulling. Not physically, not like a rope or a hand, but in the way that gravity is not something you decide to obey. You just fall toward it. I was falling toward that door. The door at the end was different from the others. It did not have a viewport. It was sealed with a magnetic lock that required a keycard and a biometric scan, and I had neither. But when I reached the door, it opened for me. Just swung inward, easy and slow, like it had been waiting. The room inside was dark. Not the kind of dark that resolves when your eyes adjust. The kind of dark that is a presence in itself, the kind you feel pressing against your skin. And from inside that dark, something spoke my name. Not the voice from the corridor. A different one. Lower. More patient. The kind of voice that sounds like it has all the time in the world, because it does. And it said my name, and it said, "You should have turned around." I woke up. I reported the dream to the medical team within the hour. A very calm, very clinical doctor I had met only once before sat across from me and took notes, and asked me questions about sleep hygiene and stress levels, and whether I had been exposed to any new compounds in the lab. He told me this kind of dream was not uncommon in high-stress research environments. He told me the rule existed because sometimes the content of these dreams gave the medical team useful information about a researcher's psychological state, and early intervention was always preferable to late intervention. He said it in a way that was completely reasonable and completely terrifying, and I nodded along with everything he said and went back to my room and did not sleep again that night. The next day I did something I had not done since my first week. I stood in the corridor outside Wing C and I looked at it. Just the corridor itself. From the outside. The badge scanner on the wall beside the entrance. The door, which was solid, no windows. The small sign above it that read restricted access, level 4 clearance required, which was standard enough. And below that, a smaller sign, one that I was almost certain had not been there the last time I was near this corridor. A white sign with black text that said current occupancy, 1. I stood there looking at that sign for longer than I should have. Because the level 4 containment units in Wing C held specimens. Not personnel. They were not designed for human occupancy. The sign made no sense in the context of the facility's documented research. Specimens were logged, catalogued, numbered. You would not track a specimen with an occupancy sign. Occupancy signs were for rooms that held people. Or maybe for something in between. I went to find Priya. I found her in the break room, eating a sandwich and reading one of the approved journals with the practiced calm of someone who has made peace with her surroundings. I sat down across from her and I asked her, as carefully as I could, about the occupancy sign on Wing C. She stopped chewing. Just for a second. Then she swallowed and set down her journal and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. It was not fear, exactly. It was something older than fear. It was the look of someone who has decided, a long time ago, that there are questions they do not ask anymore. She said, "Where did you see that?" I told her. She nodded. She folded her napkin neatly and placed it on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "Mara, I've been here 4 years. I'm going to tell you something that I probably shouldn't, and I'm going to ask you not to ask me anything else about it after I'm done. Okay?" I said okay. She said, "The sign changes. It doesn't always say 1. Sometimes it says 0. Sometimes it says 2. I saw it say 4 once, a year ago, and I went home and I threw up in my bathroom and I did not go near that corridor for a month." She paused. "The number on the sign is not a count of specimens. I don't know exactly what it counts. But whatever it counts, it's not the same when the lights are on as when the lights are off. And I know that because Sam told me that he went past that corridor at 2 in the morning once, during an early morning shift, and the sign said 0. And then the lights flickered, and he looked up at the sign, and it said 7. She picked up her journal. "Don't go near Wing C after dark, Mara. I mean that. The rule says 2200, but if you're smart, you don't go near it after sunset." She went back to reading. The conversation was over. I thought about that for the rest of the day. 7. 7 was the number that kept appearing. Specimen 7, the one you were not to make eye contact with. The sign reading 7. Rule 5 on the card, do not make eye contact with Specimen 7. I turned it over in my mind, looking at it from different angles, not willing to say out loud, even to myself, the shape of the conclusion that was forming. That evening, I did something I should not have done. I want to be clear that I am not proud of it, and I am not recommending it as a course of action. I want to be clear that every single thing that happened to me after that point has its root in the choice I made that evening. I made a note in my personal journal, the handwritten one I kept in my room, a journal which no one at the facility was supposed to have access to but which I kept anyway because I needed somewhere to put all the things I couldn't say out loud. I made a note, and the note said tomorrow? Wing C. Early morning. Before anyone else is in the building. I went to sleep and I did not dream. I woke at 4:30 in the morning. I dressed quietly. I put my badge around my neck and I put the laminated rule card in my pocket, some instinct making me want it close. The residential wing was silent. The night security shifts were staffed minimally, 3 guards for the whole facility, and I knew from the shift rotations I had casually memorized over 6 weeks that the guard on overnight duty did their rounds at the top and bottom of each hour, which gave me about 20 minutes between passes. I walked down corridor 7 and through the connection point to the research wing, and then I stood at the entrance to Wing C. The sign above the door said current occupancy, 1. The door was sealed. My badge had level 2 clearance. The Wing C entrance required level 4. I had known this going in and I had a plan, the kind of plan that seems reasonable at 4:30 in the morning when you are running on too little sleep and too much unresolved fear and the absolute conviction that you deserve to know what is happening in the building where you eat and sleep and spend your days. Joel had level 4 clearance. Joel had also, 2 days ago, left his secondary badge in the break room by accident, and I had picked it up and put it in the lost and found box in lab rather than handing it directly to security, which was technically correct procedure but which meant the badge was sitting in a cardboard box in lab rather than in Joel's pocket. I am not going to tell you I am a good person for what I did next. I went to Lab A. I retrieved Joel's badge from the lost and found box. I carried it back to Wing C. I held it up to the reader. The light turned green. The door clicked open. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. The corridor inside was exactly as it had been in my dream. Longer than it should have been from the outside. Pale green walls. Fluorescent lights. Numbered doors with viewport windows. That sound at the edge of hearing that was almost a sound. I walked in. The doors on either side were all sealed. I looked through the viewport of the first one, which was marked C01, and saw an ordinary-looking laboratory space, unmanned, with benches and equipment, and nothing that seemed unusual at 4:30 in the morning. The second door, C02, was the same. C03 was dark inside, and I could not see anything. C04 had a light on, and through the viewport I could see an enclosure within the room, a large plexiglass and steel tank of some kind, and inside the tank, something pale, something that was not quite still, something that shifted position as I watched in a way that my brain initially categorized as swaying but which resolved, as I looked longer, into a rhythm that was not swaying but breathing. I moved on. I kept moving toward the door at the end. I passed C05, which was dark. C06, which had the lights on but appeared to be used for storage, shelves stacked with sealed containers of a dark amber liquid. C07, which was, I noted, the only door in the corridor without a label number, and which I realized after a moment was the one I had been walking toward the whole time, the way you sometimes realize mid-sentence what word you were reaching for. C07 had no viewport. There was a placard on the wall beside it. Metal engraved, the kind that does not get changed. It read observation only, and no direct interaction. Do not enter without dual authorization and escort. The door was slightly open. Not swung wide. Just cracked, maybe 2 inches, with a thin line of darkness visible along one edge. Rule 8. If you find a door open that should be closed, do not close it yourself. Call it in and wait for security. I looked at the cracked door. I thought about Rule 8. I thought about what Priya had said. The sign counting things that weren't specimens. The way Administrator Chen's face had gone carefully blank when she answered questions about what came before the rules. I pushed the door open. The room inside was small. Smaller than I expected. More clinical than I expected. 4 white walls, all bare. A floor of that same pale linoleum. A chair, one single chair, bolted to the floor facing the far wall. On the far wall, floor to ceiling, a panel of thick glass, maybe 18 inches wide and 12 feet tall, a narrow vertical window looking into something beyond the room. And on the other side of the glass, darkness. I sat down in the chair. I am not entirely sure why. Maybe because it was there, and it was facing the glass, and some part of me understood that this was what the chair was for. Maybe because my legs were not entirely steady. I looked into the glass. For a long moment, nothing. Just my own reflection, faint, and the dark behind it. I told myself this was fine. I told myself the room was just an observation room and there was nothing unusual on the other side of the glass, and I was going to get up and walk out, and put Joel's badge back and pretend none of this had happened and spend the rest of my contract following all the rules. And then something in the darkness moved. It was large. That was the first thing my brain registered, before shape or form or anything identifiable. It was large in the way that makes you understand, at a level below conscious thought, that you are significantly smaller than the thing you are sharing space with. And it was close. Very close to the glass. I could not see it clearly because the darkness behind the glass was genuine and total, not the kind that light from my side penetrated. But I could see the shape of it as it moved, a shifting, a rearrangement, The way you can track someone moving through a completely dark room by the change in your perception of the space. It stopped moving. It was directly in front of the glass. I thought, with absolute clarity, about Rule 5. Do not make eye contact with Specimen 7 through the containment glass. I stared at the glass. I understood, suddenly and completely, that I was already making a mistake. That the mistake was not in whether I made eye contact but in that I was here at all, in this room, in this chair, at 4:30 in the morning with a borrowed badge and the door behind me open, and that whatever was on the other side of the glass had been waiting for exactly this. Not for me specifically. For any one of us. For whoever, eventually, would not be able to leave well enough alone. I started to stand up. Something pressed against the glass from the other side. Not a hand. I don't want to say it was a hand. It was a shape that suggested the function of a hand without being one. A thing that was doing what a hand would do, pressing against the surface, in the way that something which has observed hands long enough might attempt to replicate the behavior without having the anatomy. The glass did not break. It did not flex. It was, clearly, engineered for far worse than whatever pressure was being applied. But the gesture of it, the deliberate, almost careful quality of the gesture, was the most frightening thing I have ever seen. And then it spoke. Not my name. Not this time. It spoke 2 words, and the words came from everywhere in the room at once, from the walls and the floor and the glass and from inside my own chest, and the 2 words it said were, "Found you." I do not remember leaving the room. I have a gap in my memory between sitting in that chair and being in corridor 7, walking fast with my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my teeth. My hands were empty. I do not know when I let go of Joel's badge. I walked to my room and I sat on my bed and I looked at the wall for a very long time. In the morning, I reported all of it to Administrator Chin. Not all at once. I started with the sign, which I could report without implicating myself. Then the conversation with Priya, which I apologized for, because it had been outside designated discussion parameters. Then, after a long pause, I told her about Wing C. About Joel's badge. About the room. About the glass. About what was on the other side of it. About the 2 words. She listened to everything without interrupting. She wrote in her notepad. When I finished, she put her pen down and took her glasses off and looked at me. "You're not being transferred to the medical wing," she said. "But not because you don't qualify for it. Because you were honest with me, and that counts for something here. And because you did not look it in the eyes." I asked her what Specimen 7 was. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "What it is, we don't entirely know. How long it's been here, we do not know. What it wants, we believe we have a general understanding of, which is why the rules exist. What it can do to a person who breaks those rules, we know with some specificity, because we have observed it. The rules are not security theater, Mara. They are not bureaucratic ass covering. They are the product of very specific losses. There are people who broke those rules and are not here anymore. Not because they resigned. Not because they were transferred. Because they are not here anymore, in the most fundamental sense of that phrase." She put her glasses back on. "It can find you anywhere in this building. We believe it can only act on you if you establish a connection with it. Looking into its eyes is one way to establish that connection. Responding to the sound of your name is another. Sitting in that observation room is another. You established a connection last night. It knows you now. That is not something we can undo." I felt the room get very cold. She told me that I had 2 options. I could leave the facility immediately under the terms of my contract, with a significant severance package and the NDA documents, and the understanding that I would never speak of any of this under penalty of very serious legal consequences. Or I could stay, continue my work, follow the rules with absolute rigidity, and trust that the containment protocols in place were sufficient to prevent Specimen 7 from acting on the connection it had established. She said the containment protocols had held for 19 years. She said she could not promise they would hold for 19 more. I asked her which of the two options she recommended. She said, "I can't tell you that. But I can tell you that some of the people who left are not doing well. And some of the people who stayed have lived perfectly normal lives after their contracts ended. And some of those people, the ones who stayed, have gone on to believe that maybe what is in that room is not as dangerous as it seemed from the inside. That it was the fear that was the real hazard." She paused. "I can also tell you that I have never in 19 years gone near Wing C after dark. And I never will." I took the severance package. I signed the documents. I packed my single bag and I got in the black SUV with the tinted windows and I went back to the world. I picked up the remnants of my graduate school life and I tried to reassemble them. I finished my degree. I took a teaching position at a small college on the East Coast. I live in a house with 2 cats and a garden and neighbors who wave at me when I take out my recycling. I follow certain rules that I set for myself. I do not open a door that is already slightly ajar without calling out first. I do not go into any basement or sublevel space after dark. I do not sit in chairs that face mirrors or windows when the room behind the glass is dark. I do not respond if I hear my name spoken from a direction where no one should be. I have heard it twice since I left the facility. Once in a grocery store parking lot, late evening, when I was alone between rows of cars. Once in my own house, at 2 in the morning, from the direction of the hallway outside my bedroom door. Both times I kept moving. Both times I did not look. I have been thinking, lately, about Administrator Chen's words. The containment protocols have held for 19 years. That was 3 years ago now. Which makes 22 years. And I find myself wondering, not every day, but often enough, whether they are still holding. Whether that panel of thick glass is still intact. Whether that room is still occupied by one. Whether the occupancy sign has changed. Whether whatever learned my name is still in there. Or whether it found another way. I sleep with the lights on now. I have for 3 years. My cats sometimes wake up in the night and stare at the doorway with the fixed, absolute attention of animals that are tracking something I cannot see. And when that happens, I pick them up and I hold them close and I look at the ceiling and I think about Rule 11. Do not respond to it. Do not turn toward the sound. Continue what you are doing until you have exited the immediate area. I think about it, and I tell myself that I am exiting. Slowly, quietly, every single day. Moving away from that place, from that room, from the shape behind the glass that pressed against it like a hand. I tell myself that I am far enough away now that it cannot reach me. And most nights, I almost believe it. Most nights. But some nights, when the cats go still and the house goes quiet in that particular held-breath way, I think about what it said to me through the glass. Those 2 words, spoken from everywhere at once, from the walls and the floor and from somewhere inside my own chest. Found you. And I wonder whether that was a statement about that moment in that room, on that specific night 3 years ago. Or whether it was something else. Something longer in its scope. A promise rather than an observation. A declaration of patience from something that has been waiting behind that glass for more than 2 decades. That has watched researcher after researcher come and go, that has learned from each of them, that has grown better and more precise in how it reaches out, that has gotten better at the sound of names. I wonder if it is still learning. I wonder what it has learned since me. I keep the laminated rule card in my wallet. I have carried it every day for 3 years. The edges are soft now from handling. The print is still clear. I take it out sometimes and I read all 11 rules and I think about the people who wrote them, the people who distilled their worst experiences down to 11 clean instructions so that the next person might be a little safer, might make it out the way I did, might not become one of the people who are no longer with the facility. Whoever you are, reading or listening to this now, if you ever find yourself in a place with rules that don't quite make sense, if you are ever handed a card or a sheet or a list and told that every item on it exists because something specific happened, if you are ever told that there are things in your workplace that you do not need to fully understand in order to follow the rules about, follow the rules. That is all I have to say. Every single time, follow the rules. Because the rules are not the walls that keep the thing inside contained. The rules are the walls that keep you safe while you figure out the door. And sometimes, the most important door is the one you walk back out of. Good night. Keep the lights on. And to whatever is reading this over my shoulder right now, I did not turn around. I will never turn around. And oh my goodness. Oh everyone. I have to take a moment here because Dana, if you are listening to this, I want you to know that I read this multiple times before we recorded it, and every single time, that last part, every single time, the lights on part, it got me. It genuinely got me. This story is one of those ones that sits with you, the kind that doesn't let you go even when the recording is done, even when the lights come back up in the studio. The rules. The occupancy sign. The thing behind the glass that pressed against it like a hand. I cannot stop thinking about Rule 11. Can you imagine? Can you imagine living and working somewhere with a rule that says you will hear your name from nowhere, and when you do not respond? The fact that someone had to write that rule. The fact that it was specific enough, documented enough, happened enough times that it made the list. That is the detail that wrecked me. What I love about this story is that it does exactly what the best horror does. It gives you a character who is rational, disciplined, following the rules, doing everything right, and then it puts one perfectly placed crack in all of that, one moment of completely human curiosity that most of us would have in the same situation, and it shows you what is on the other side of that crack. Not a monster, not a creature with a name and a mythology, not something that Hollywood has already taught us how to react to. Something older than that. Something patient. Something that does not need to chase you because it has already learned your name, and it has all the time in the world. Dana, thank you. From all of us here at Bella Dark Tales, thank you for trusting us with this. Stay safe. Keep your rules. And please keep the lights on. Now, if this story reached into your chest and grabbed something, I want you to do 3 things for me right now. First, give this video a like. It costs you nothing and it means everything to this channel and to the people who send us their stories. People like Dana who need to know that someone is listening, that someone cares. Second, share this story. Share it with the person in your life who stays up too late watching horror content, with a friend who says they don't scare easily, with whoever you know who needs a very good reason to keep the lights on tonight. And third, subscribe to Bella Dark Tales if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so that you never miss a story. We are here every week with new voices, new experiences, new things that go bump in the dark and leave rules behind. And if you have a story of your own, something you witnessed, something you experienced, something you have been carrying around and cannot explain and cannot stop thinking about, please send it to us. You can reach us at belladarktales@gmail.com. We read everything. We take every submission seriously. And we will always change the details you need changed. Your story matters. The things that happen to you matter. And there are people out there, hundreds of thousands of them, sitting in the dark with their headphones in, who need to know that they are not the only ones who have seen something they cannot explain. Tell us your story. We are listening. Until next time, from all of us here at Bella Dark Tales, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, some doors are open for a reason. And the reason is not always the one you think. Good night, everyone. Good night.